Hello. For the Red Team Lab setup section, we'll be going over some brief steps for setting up a simple and basic Windows domain for you to do your Red Team effects on. First, I'll be showing you where to download VirtualBox, Kali, and the Windows operating systems. But since this course is focused on hands-on Red Team TTPs, I will not be going step by step into how to install VirtualBox, Kali, or Windows. But after you install these virtual machines, I will show you a very simple and basic domain setup, including joining the computers to the domain and adding a few domain admin accounts. In this lecture, we'll be going over where to download VirtualBox, Windows, and Kali Linux. Alright, let's do a quick search for VirtualBox. Just to give us a quick overview of VirtualBox, VirtualBox is a free hypervisor. So that enables us to run VMs, aka virtual machines. Let's go to the downloads link. And as you can see, based on your operating system, there's multiple options. But because I use Windows, I'm just going to use the Windows host option. And after you download it, there's plenty of installation guides you can follow to install VirtualBox. Alright, next up I'll be showing where to get Kali Linux. Just for a quick overview of Kali Linux is a Debian-based Linux distribution with a whole array of hacker tools pre-installed. Go to the downloads link from kali.org, and as you can see there's multiple options, but I recommend the Kali 64-bit ISO. Just take note that it is a 3.6 gigabyte file. Make sure you have plenty of space on your computer. Another option is to download a pre-configured VM by Offensive Security, which in this case I would recommend the 64-bit Kali VM as well. And as shown, you have the VMware option if you prefer to use VMware Workstation instead of VirtualBox. But then further down you can see a VirtualBox VM as well. Next up, I'll show you an option for Windows 10. As you can see, Microsoft offers free Windows 10 virtual machines from the developer.microsoft.com website. So just be aware that these are evaluation versions, and I've noticed at times that they have restarted on me. Notice that there's a VMware and VirtualBox option to download from. Another option will be to buy a license of Windows 10 and then download and install from the ISO. Now I'll go over an option of downloading Windows Server. As you can see, there is an evaluation version of Windows Server 2019 from Microsoft.com. There's an ISO version that you could download, and the evaluation lasts for 180 days. Also, if you scroll down, you can see plenty of other options as well, such as Windows Server 2012 R2. For the demos in the course, I will be using Windows Server 2012 R2 as the domain controller. In this video, you can follow along if you want to create a simple domain so we could have a small environment you could practice your Red Team effects on. For this environment, we'll be setting up a Windows Server VM, which will be the domain controller for a domain in which our Windows client will be joined to. So the first thing we will want to do on a newly created Windows Server, which will be our domain controller, is to set up our IP address statically. This will ensure the IP never changes in case there is a DHCP server on the local network that will lease IPs randomly every so often, which would effectively change our domain controller IP, which isn't good if your clients are trying to connect to the domain with the wrong IP for the domain controller. So take a quick glance at how I manually set up the IP address to 192.168.122.129, and we'll close out and next configure the Windows Server to a domain controller. So just X out of everything until we get back to the server manager, which is a simple dashboard that has a lot of useful links for quick access to configuring the Windows server. After clicking on Configure this local server, click on the computer name, as we will change it to a domain controller name that is more suitable. I chose the name FunDC01, DC being short for domain controller, and restart the computer to take on the effect. The reason I chose the name FunDC01 was because it's a simple way for me to have the domain, which is fun, and to show that it's a domain controller. On the Server Manager, click on Add Roles and Features so we can start the setup of the domain controller. Click Next and then ensure you have role-based or feature-based installation selected, since we aren't doing a VDI. Click Next on this page. Select Active Directory Domain Services so we can easily add and manage users on the domain later on. And scrolling through, you can see a lot of other interesting roles that you could add for the server. Next up, you can see a list of features that could be installed on the server. But for a simple setup, we can ignore this. Now let's install the Active Directory role we selected. Click on Promote this server to a domain controller, and next select Add a new forest, giving the root domain name fun.com. We use fun as our domain, and I just use .com, but others may use .local, or really whatever you want. It doesn't really matter for our local domain setup that won't even be registered on the internet. Next, put in a DSRM or Directory Services Restore Mode password for offline emergency maintenance, and just click Next on the Specify Delegations option. For the next few options, just click Next as well. It looks like there's an issue, and this issue will happen if the local administrator account on the Windows system does not have a password. To fix this, we can add a password simply by first opening up an administrator command prompt. Run netuser to see the local admins that are currently on the server. And typically, the main local admin of concern is normally just named administrator. So run the following netuser command to add or change the password of the administrator account. And now that the administrator account has a password, click Previous and Next to attempt the installation again. Be aware that a lot of these installation steps do take quite a bit of time, depending on the hardware you may have. So don't be alarmed if it takes quite a while. Setting up a domain controller could normally be a day or more of a task for systems administrators based on the hardware they are working with and the type of domain that they are required to set up. And many restarts are also a very typical part of this process. Once the server is restarted, log into the local administrator account, as we will be setting up some user accounts through Active Directory. Wait a little for the server desktop to load up, and then search and open up Active Directory User and Computers, as this will be where we can manage user accounts. In here, you could get a list of information of our fun.com domain. For example, you could get a list of computers connected to the domain and also a list of the domain controllers. Click the Users folder and you'll get a list of users and groups in the domain. To create a user, you can right-click and click New and User. For our first user creation, we'll create a user named John Doe. And after filling in the first and last name, we could then fill in the user logon name, which I'll just do in the format firstname.lastname. Then we'll write in a password that's complex enough for the Windows domain. After you write in the password, uncheck user must change password at next logon, so we don't have to change it next time we log in. And also make sure password never expires is checked. And now that we have the user created, let's right click on it and go to properties so we can change the group the user is in. Click on the account tab and you'll see some account options and also the option to unlock the account if it is ever locked. And now to change the group the member is in, go to the Member Of tab. And here you'll currently see that the user John Doe is in the domain users group. So next what we'll do is we'll create a domain admin that will be in the domain admins group. We'll right click, click on new, and then user. I'll name the first domain admin Peter Pan with the same username format of first.lastname, peter.pan. I'm just naming it this way so I can easily distinguish the admins and users myself. And again, we'll type in a password that's complex enough for the domain. And then also, make sure user must change password at next logon is unchecked. And then also password never expires. And after creating the account, right click on it and go to properties. And once the properties are open, go to the Member Of tab. And you'll notice that the member is only in the domain users group. So click on add so we could add him to the domain admins group. Type in domain admins, click check names so you could confirm that the group is there, and then click OK so we could add him to the domain admins group. Alright, next we'll create a domain user and a domain admin again. But this time just right click copy on a user we already created. And since I right click copied on Peter Pan, that means this user I create should be a domain admin. So I filled in the name Jason Bourne and user logon name jason.bourne. And again, type in a complex password because of the domain group policy, which you could easily change. And then after creating the user account, we'll right click, properties, and then go to Member Of to see what groups he's in, which is already domain admins and domain users. Now we'll create a normal domain user account by right clicking on John Doe and then copy. And then for this account, I'll just call it Jane Doe. And then of course the same first.last name format for username. And again, a complex password, which I've been using the same password for each account just for this red team environment. Then right click, properties, and go to the Member Of tab. And notice he is only in the domain users group since we copied a user that was only in the domain users group. So now that we have enough users for our red team domain, let's go over an example of how to add a Windows client to the domain. So while you're on your Windows client VM, which could either be Windows 7, Windows 10, or wherever you want, the first thing we want to do is to set the IP address of the computer. So I'm just doing this manually because I do not have a DHCP server in my local network. So set the IP address to an IP address that's not currently being used. The subnet mask needs to be the same subnet mask that was used for the domain controller. And then we can set the preferred DNS server to the IP of the domain controller. That way the client could resolve fun.com. And then now that we have an IP address on the same network as the domain controller, we could then join the computer to the domain. To join the Windows client to the domain, go to System Properties, and then click on Change, which will give you the option to join a domain. I set a new computer name for the client called Win10User, and just type in fun.com in the domain field, and OK to bring up a prompt to join with credentials, which in this case, I'll be joining with the peter.pan domain admin we created earlier. And then after successfully joining the domain, you'll have to restart the computer. So then after the computer has successfully restarted, you'll want to click on Other User and then type in the domain admin peter.pan's credentials to log into the domain fun. And then since this is the first time that this account is logging in to the domain on this client, it might take a little while longer than a normal login to load up. So then, once it loads up, the first thing I'll do is open up a command prompt and type "who am I" just to confirm that I am peter.pan. And then of course netuser peter.pan/domain just to confirm I am a domain admin. And then, because this is a beginner's course, you can follow along to disable the Windows Firewall. In Windows Firewall settings, click Turn Windows Firewall on or off. And then for domain network settings, private network settings, and public network settings, we'll just click Turn off Windows Firewall. Also turn off Windows Firewall on the Windows client as well. And then next, we'll just disable the Windows Defender so we don't have to be worried about spending time obfuscating our payload to evade the antivirus.